everyone, welcome to the September 15th edition of the TimeformUS forecast. I'm David Aragona. Unfortunately, my usual co-host, Craig Mulkowski, is still on the sidelines. He's been dealing with a family issue that I know he wrote about on Twitter, so hopefully going to have him back pretty soon. But happy this week to have joining me once again, Emily Gullikson, to handicap some Woodbine for Saturday. Emily, welcome back to the podcast. I know we didn't have you on that long ago. I think we did some Saratoga Del Mar handicapping over the summer, but with Woodbine having this interesting card coming up on Saturday, I know that's somewhere that you focus quite a bit, so I wanted to have you on to help me handicap it a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I hope everything's going well with Craig. Just somebody I totally appreciate as a member of this community and a great guy. But stepping in today and for Woodbine, and I'm actually going to be heading up to Woodbine for the first time ever. So this was like really fun that you invited me on because it got me even more excited about this weekend.
Oh, it's really exciting. Woodbine's a track that I've never been to. It's on the bucket list. Hope to get there one year. Just, given I've heard so many positive things about it and the cool track configuration. I'd like to get there. So hope you enjoy it. And it's a pretty interesting card that they put together for Saturday. We've got these 4 graded stakes races, 3 grade 1s, including the Woodbine Mile, but especially this pair of 2-year-old races, the Natalma and the Summer, which both drew large, interesting fields. We were just talking a little bit before we started recording. Weird situation that I know they have crop up sometimes at Woodbine, allowing multiple entries on the same day in different races, but we do have 4 fillies cross-centered in the Summer, so a little bit of guesswork as we kind of go through this sequence, deciding where some of these horses might run or trying to predict it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you get, like you mentioned, just such a great stack of races, especially these 2-year-old races, because you have those horses that have been running at Woodbine and then some new faces. And that really just makes things really interesting. And then from a betting standpoint, from some of the connections that get overbet, we'll discuss that as we go through the card. But starting off in race 6, which is the Summer Stakes, one of the things I just wanted to note with the fillies that are cross-centered, I've noticed so much more this season that fillies and colts are running together more often, whether it's in maiden special weight races or some of the restricted stakes races. So I just wanted to mention that for people that are just kind of jumping in on the big day and find that change. It's just something that I've noticed and I don't find so unusual because it's been the pattern this season.
Yeah, it's something that we see a lot outside of the United States, especially when it comes to the turf and synthetic racing, just globally. Fillies compete against the males pretty regularly, especially when they're 2-year-olds. So it kind of makes sense that connections would see that they can compete effectively and try it. And it seems like that's happening a lot in Canada right now. Mark Casse has spoken about that he particularly is not afraid to run the fillies against the males. And as you handicap these races, you see quite a few examples of it, especially among his horses, but including a few others. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Just to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to discuss on this podcast, we're going to talk about the guaranteed Pick-5 sequence. It is races 6 through 10, so including all 4 of those graded stakes races, and then ending with the 10th race, which is an allowance on the Tapeta surface going a route distance. I'll just kind of note that the Pick-5 at Woodbine, it is, I believe, a 20-cent minimum. It's not a sequence you have to play. We always talk about the Pick-5s on this TimeformUS forecast. It's just kind of the focus and the types of sequences that we discuss. But as listeners, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to play the Pick-5. You should always play your opinions at the end of the day. If you really like a horse in the race, you shouldn't shy away from a win bet or tailor the type of wager that you target to the opinions that you have in the sequence. And a lot of times the impetus to play a Pick-5 at these tracks is the lower takeout. I should just note that's not the case at Woodbine. Woodbine is a little bit out of step with the takeout in the Pick-5. I think it's at 25% compared to some other tracks. So I feel like I'd be remiss not to note that as we start to talk about this sequence. But it's still a set of really interesting races. So I think when you're deciding what to bet or what to handicap, you do have to weigh those factors, the takeout, that's always the case, but also your opinions and how much of an edge you have in the sequence, because sometimes it does make sense to play in the higher takeout pools, just depending on what your opinions are.
Yes, it's really responsible that you mentioned that. And then there's also, just if you're kind of going in a different direction or want to pick and choose some races, there is a Woodbine tournament that day and you can play on track. The registration will close. We're recording this Friday morning, so it's going to close at 12 Eastern time. So people that are listening might not have a chance to jump in, but I know there are a lot of people that are playing. It is on track. It can also be online. And it's a cash tournament. There's BCBC seats, and you have to bet it's all Woodbine and a minimum of 5 races.
It's good to know. Maybe you can fire off a tweet about that before the noon deadline, and people will see it prior to after we record today, as we're doing this on Friday morning, as Emily noted. Well, let's dive into this Pick-5 sequence, as there's a lot to talk about. We'll begin with that 6th race, the Grade 1 Summer, and this one has 11 entered. We'll see how many ultimately compete in this race, as we do have those 4 fillies that are cross-entered in the Natalma. Regardless of who shows up, though, on the filly side, Emily, it does feel like the number 3, My Boy Prince, is going to attract a lot of support in here, and he's kind of the horse that you have to start the conversation with and develop some opinions about, because he's coming off this smashing victory last time in the Simcoe Stakes, which was really just about 3 weeks ago when he won by 14 lengths, going the 6.5 furlong distance on the Tapeta. But now he's stretching out, trying the turf for the first time. This is obviously a progressive horse that's really been improving quickly this summer for Mark Casse, but how do you assess a horse like this that's going to get bet heavily, in all likelihood, off that visually impressive victory last time, but is trying something new?
Yes, he is trying something new, and it'll also be important to just kind of note the scratches and the complexion of this race shape, because that could upgrade or downgrade a horse like My Boy Prince, who has shown that brilliant speed. He stayed on as the best of the speed at Woodbine back on June 18th, and then again in that most recent start that you mentioned in the Simcoe, stretching out. So he's going to be showing early speed. And there are some others in this field that are capable of showing early speed as well, but some of those horses could come out. So that would certainly upgrade him. But as you mentioned, he's tough to knock off what he's done so far. Even his debut race, going a little bit shorter, was a good race. He just kind of conceded the lead early to the eventual winner and then started to make up some ground late. So really tough to knock on those efforts. And again, it could come down to pace and who stays in the race.
Just like zooming out for a second, with you handicapping Woodbine on a fairly regular basis, how do you generally assess these horses that are going from the synthetic track at Woodbine to the turf? Because it really can be different on every track. Each synthetic course feels like it's a little different from one track to the next based on the type of track they're using, the climate, or where the track is located. At Woodbine, how do you view that? Is it just kind of a horse-by-horse basis? I know you're not somebody who's super into pedigrees or looking at stats from that standpoint, but is it just trying to get a sense of how the horse looks physically? How do you assess those?
Yeah, I think that's the second point, is it's more about the individual, right? Because we've seen horses that can translate their form to turf, synthetic, dirt. It just really depends on the type of horse, the class of horse, and the intention as well. You know, the type of trainer, what they're looking to do, where the horse is in their form cycle. Again, it's going to come down to pace and where the horse is placed. So I put a little bit more emphasis on the individual more than the track itself. I think both courses generally play fair. I mean, we could see some changes just depending on weather, big days. So you should always monitor that and stay flexible. But generally, it's pretty consistent, those surfaces.
Yeah, I was using DRF Formulator to sort of dive into the stats for Mark Casse, because he obviously has a huge sample of runners that you can analyze that have been in this type of situation before. And it's interesting. Casse actually has really good stats going synthetic to turf, especially with horses that won their last starts in graded stakes races. He's got a really high percentage with a healthy ROI. Not so much with horses going from sprints to routes. So it's sort of a dichotomy there where he does well with the surface thing, not so much with the distance thing. So I think maybe with My Boy Prince, I'd emphasize the negative stat a little more, just given the fact that he's going to be a short price. So I don't want to put too much stock in the high ROI stats for a horse like this, but just something to consider with him. I do want to briefly touch upon the fillies in this race, Emily, because we're obviously going to talk about them as well when we get to the Natalma, but just in a general sense, it feels like this race has a little less depth to it than the Natalma, at least from my perspective. Some of the males entered here feel like they're a little more of a stretch than some of the long shots might be in the Natalma. So I think that for a few of these fillies, this might actually be the easier spot to pick up a check, maybe not to win. I don't know. We could have different opinions about that, but I think it's just a race that you're more likely to hit the board for one of the fillies if they want to run here. So I do want to talk about a few of them that might land in this race. I mean, Erosa is the most obvious one, coming off that victory in the Catch a Glimpse last time, where people make a lot of her trip that she had to wait a little bit. all things considered, I think it kind of worked out for her. I mean, she had to pause briefly, but she got a pretty good trip, all things considered. So she ran really well last time. Big speed figure for that race. She obviously makes sense here, but was there anybody else from the female side that you were sort of, that you would like to see stay in this race, I guess is the way to put it?
Well, a couple things. I think you and I both agree that, or I agree with you as far as the strength of both these races, and this being a little bit weaker, and then just kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about the fillies running against the colts as it being not that much of a difference. So the connection's looking for the right spot to place those horses. The other thing that is kind of worth a mention is there are some rider changes in here, which are kind of interesting. One of those being on My Boy Prince, but again, that could change just depending on the scratch. And as far as Air Rosa, again, this just kind of goes into where these horses land, right? Because I agree with you in terms of the trip. I thought Hernandez, who's going to stick with one of the Cassie horses, Velasquez taking over today, gave her a really good ride. She has natural speed. She actually broke on top. And then rated back, had a little bit of traffic. And then I agree, it kind of worked out in her favor in terms of the way the race shape played out. But having that natural early speed, having some other speed in this race, Tripp could be in play, and especially with a new rider and Hernandez possibly going elsewhere. I found that a little bit interesting, and if they end up staying in this race, I'm not as thrilled with her. She is progressive. She has done everything right, but as one of the ones that could be a shorter price, I'd probably prefer some of the others. Now, in terms of that rider change, Golden Canary will get the rider change, perhaps. Savashi landing here. Rosario picking up on My Boy Prince. Just so many interesting changes. But again, stay flexible because those things could make a difference. And Golden Canary is another one that she's been a little bit versatile, but last out was kind of benefit from that softer pace. And I think that assisted her on the lead.
Yeah, I felt the same way. I mean, the pace situations were so markedly different between the Catch a Glimpse and the Soaring Free, which were run on the same day. And obviously, Phillies did well in both of those races, even the one for the males, the Soaring Free. But just Golden Canary was so much with the flow that day. It was really just dominated towards the front end, and she got to sprint home. To me, visually, she looks like a little more of a sprinter. The pedigree sort of confirms that, so I'm kind of viewing her that way and not wanting her in this spot. I was trying to read into the rider situation in this race. It's really hard to get some clues as to where these horses might ultimately land. I think you do want to note that a couple of riders are named on multiple horses in this one race. Rosario is named on 2. Kazushi Kimura also named on 2. So there are going to be rider switches late. So we'll see how that all plays out with the scratches and everything. But we're generally on the same page with some of those fillies. One horse that I feel like I overlooked a little bit when I first handicapped this race and started to get interested in her when I was handicapping the Natalma, and then kind of had to circle back and say, well, I kind of hope she runs in the summer instead because it's a better spot. And that's Go With Gusto, the other Mark Cassie horse in this race, because I think he's got 5 in here. She's one that initially I overlooked a little bit. She was disqualified, you could say controversially or not, for that debut victory back in the middle of August on the inner turf at Woodbine. But I thought she showed some likable attributes that day. I mean, the field wasn't bad. We've seen some runbacks out of that race that maybe haven't won, but they've been okay in terms of repeating speed figures and stuff like that. And she, to me, was not necessarily traveling in the bridle around the turn, but the jockey kept after her. And once she got into the clear, it's like she saw that daylight and just exploded. And I like to see that attribute from a young horse. So it just feels like there might be a little bit of upside with her. And she's one that, as I started to get more interested in her, I'm kind of thinking maybe she's one that I hope stays in this summer because she's going to be a playable price. And I think it's a more realistic spot for her than the Natalma.
Yeah, and another one that reason I mentioned this is it's that maiden race back on August 18th. That was one of those races that the field was split with fillies and colts and geldings. So she's had experience running against males in the past, and maybe that's some intent in here. And again, she's you'll see the running line will say 5th, but she won that race, and not easy to do. She had the 10 post, that inner turf race at a mile. That's around 2 turns. This being a 1-turn mile in the summer. So there is a little bit there on her, and was a little bit green, so could certainly take a step forward. And even that debut number, obviously she'll have to improve with some of the others. Her stablemate, My Boy Prince, would need a big move forward if he runs back to that number last out. But yeah, she would not be a surprising. She's probably going to stay around that morning line.
Yeah, I had to get in picks for this race pretty early because I had to record a video for the Daily Racing Form YouTube channel yesterday morning. So I kind of had to make some decisions about this race early on. And I picked the number 2 Carson's Run in this race. And it is a horse that I want to talk about. And, I'm comfortable, making a push for this horse. Well, I guess we'll see what kind of price he is. I just like both of his races at Saratoga. In terms of speed figures, I know that we didn't assign one, Bayer or TimeformUS, either of our Daily Racing Form speed figures for the debut, just given the fact that I think it was the only turf race on that inner turf course that day, so kind of hard to gauge the quality of that race. But he came back and ran really well with anticipation last time. That filly that defeated him, Galibrand, I think she's actually pretty good, and it's not like the pace of that race was particularly fast at all, even though it was sort of dominated by horses coming from off the pace. I just think Carson's Run and Galibrand might be pretty good, and Carson's Run was never in the most comfortable spot coming into the stretch. He had his head turned a little bit. It seemed like he didn't really want to run through that tight hole between horses, but he kept battling onto the wire. This horse just has this relentless style that I think might fit this race well, especially if some speed does stay in here. So he makes a lot of sense, and Christophe Clement has had success shipping up to Woodbine.
Yeah, I kind of went there for all those same reasons, so I won't bore the listeners in repeating what you just said, and I'll just say it in agreement. And a progressive type. Optics did assign a speed figure as far as the debut at Saratoga, which is an 82, and then Optics gave an 85. So at least there's some consistency from that standpoint. And a horse that you mentioned in terms of the trip could definitely take a step forward. It seems like there's some intent in the spot, and a logical type as well. No knocks on him.
Anybody else that you wanted to mention in this race before we move on?
Yeah, the two other Cassie runners that are going to book in the field, super attentive. I thought that was a better than looked effort. Not the most ideal ride. It was the best of the speed winner. He was in a blanket finish, little bit softer race, so a horse that's going to have to improve, but still lightly race type. That certainly could. One maybe that is worth a follow if he doesn't run well in here, and then 11 King of the Track will make that change that you kind of mentioned in terms of the stat, that stretch out of distance and surface switch. But it was a really dominant effort. I don't know how good that race was on August 13th, but he was super dominant in that race and a pretty solid pace. And Hernandez, as it's mentioned right now, is on this one. So we'll see. Maybe that's some intent. But I just wanted to give a mention to those two horses as they're making their second start.
Let's move on to the second leg of this sequence, race 7. It's the grade 3 Vigil on the synthetic course going 6 furlongs. And Emily, it feels like there's a horse in here that's going to take a lot of money. The number 6, Patches O'Houlihan, who has just been a win machine on the synthetic so far at Woodbine. He's 6 for 7 in his career. 5 of those have come sprinting on the synthetic course. He's got a lot of speed. 3-year-old has already proven he can beat the older horses. It's just he's going to be a really short price because his form is totally exposed at this point, but he still is one that I think you have to take seriously in this spot. How are you viewing him and just this race in general?
I think you have to start your handicapping with him for the reasons that he does have that record. He is going to be a short price. He has that controlling speed. Following him in his races this season, he ran a really big race coming off the bench. That was a big effort where he set the pace. He set a fast pace, took pace pressure. But since then, he's had really favorable trips. He had a perfect trip, winning in that race on June 14th, wheeling right back in 2 weeks. And then coming back in the Lake Huron Stakes, that was on the turf, sprinting 5 furlongs, another favorable trip. It was only a 4-horse field. The top 3 were kind of together and clear of the rest. Then on the July 30th race, it was another 5-horse field. He was the only horse that kind of had speed in that race, so he was an upgrade just in terms of the pace. And then the same thing in the Bold Venture, kind of a weaker race for the level, and he was just one of those horses, looking at the optics plotter, I'm sure if you go back and look at the pace projector, he'll just kind of look like that low in speed. Then when you look at today's race and the way the race shape stacks up, he's not necessarily going to have that trip. So he's going to be taking on a different dynamic than he's had as of late. So if you are looking to take him on, it could be from a pace standpoint because he's likely to face a little bit more pace pressure today.
Yeah, I recall he had that favors frontrunner designation working in his favor last time in TimeformUS for the Bold Venture. And as you said, it was just sort of an uncompetitive spot where it looked like it was the right situation for him to get that victory. He arguably made things a little more difficult on himself than they really had to be because he really, pushed on the gas about around the far turn, the half mile pole. I mean, he opened up on this field probably at a point that he didn't have to, and it looked for a second like he was coming back to them at the top of the stretch, but he kicked on again late. So it's nice to see a horse just have that grit to make two moves within a race the way that he did. So he's pretty good. I don't want to knock him too much, but it does feel like this is a more competitive pace scenario. A couple horses in particular that are supposed to go forward in here, including the number 1 Rockcrest, who I think is a horse that you have to consider in this spot because he's just getting back on the right surface. The synthetic is much more to his liking than the turf has been, even though the connections have gone back and forth between synthetic and turf throughout his entire career. If you just isolate the synth races, he looks pretty consistent overall. The issue with Rockcrest, though, Emily, is that he's another one that when he's been successful, he's gotten pretty favorable setups.
Exactly. And that's the point. So you're isolating those races where he's been successful on the synthetic, and then you have to understand why horses run good races, why horses run bad races. And when he's been able to get that easy lead, he's been able to get soft paces, he's been able to be successful. So maybe a little bit weaker in terms of class to the rival Patches O'Houlihan, but both those horses having similar running styles can make things difficult on each other.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not really viewing Rockcrest as a horse that I want to bet in this race, but I think he's important to discuss because he's, I think, the most likely one to have an impact on the outcome of Patches O'Houlihan in this race. So especially drawing the rail, I'll be interested to see what kind of ride he gets. I think handicapping this race, the inclination, at least for me, is to sort of go against some of the horses that finished behind Patches O'Houlihan in the Bold Venture. I think there's one that's a little interesting that maybe I'll get to later. I'll let you mention any of those first if you want to. But I think the inclination when you're looking at this race is just kind of gravitate towards those two drawn to the outside, sort of the new faces in this race that are switching surfaces for the first time, those being Outlaw Kid and My Buddy B. But I'll throw it to you and see where you want it to go in this race.
Yeah, initially, I mean, my process was kind of the same. I really didn't want anybody out of the Bold Venture Stakes as a whole because I just thought that race was a little bit weaker for the level going back on that race day. But then you look at this race and you're like, well, most of those horses came out of that race, so it could be weak once again. I would say the more interesting one, if I had to take a stand, would be Old Chestnut, just because I think he's going to get a much favorable trip in here. Class-wise, he's always been a little bit weaker when he's been in graded stakes companies, but if it's a weaker race, just in terms of trip, he'd probably be the one. But yeah, you have to look at those new faces in here. Outlaw Kid, he's another one that he's just going to be really tested for class in this spot, and you're not going to get much value. And number 8, My Buddy B, he's kind of the opposite because he's also going to be tested for class, but at least in the contrast to some of these others that have come up short in graded stakes races without much excuse, at least he's one that hasn't shown that yet, right? He's going to be given a chance when he's coming into this race with improving form, another one that has just natural early speed in his races, and he's always been kind of a pretty good horse. You can go back to his debut. He broke his maiden on debut at Turfway Park, so on the synthetic, and did so showing a lot of grit. So I think there's some intent for this horse in this race, and he's definitely one I'd be using just because for some of the others I kind of know who they are. I don't really know who this horse is, and I'm willing to give him a chance just as the connections are.
Yeah, between those two new faces, I was kind of leaning in the same direction. I kind of don't think there's going to be the price disparity that's indicative in the morning line, but 5-2 to 20-1, that doesn't make any sense to me. I think they'll come together a little bit, but My Buddy B almost has to be the bigger price of those two horses. And I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, he's been improving lately. And when you go back and watch that one synthetic race at Turfway back in 2022, like you said, he showed a lot of gameness that day. The runner-up from there, Blue Devil, that he was in the photo with, has actually turned out to be a pretty good high-level allowance horse. And My Buddy B, I mean, after that, maybe he didn't like going longer, but he sort of didn't run as well on a couple of other surfaces as he had on synthetic, and recently he's improved on the dirt, but he might have just improved overall as a horse in the past year. And Paulo Lobo is just the kind of trainer that, to me, is like the bettor's friend, because he's got great stats doing a ton of things. He just doesn't take as much money as he really deserves to, and he does especially well in some of these synthetic races. He does very well, good stats at Turfway, and maybe that'll translate here. So I just think this is a really interesting placement for a horse that they have clearly managed very conservatively throughout his career, running at places like Mountaineer and Belterra, but now they're taking a shot in this race race. They must like the way he's doing at this point in time. So I think he's pretty interesting, and there's some intention with that horse. Circling back to the Bold Venture, the one that I would say is a little interesting from that race is Super Watson, because he was just a horse that was not going to be successful given the way that race played out from a flow standpoint. When Patches O'Houlihan set that sort of soft opening quarter and then really accelerated in the second quarter, it just works against a horse like this who was trying to stay a little bit closer than normal, but then really had to come off the bridle at about the half-mile pole to sort of keep pace with those horses, because he's more naturally that one-run closer, and it sort of sapped the typical late kick that we see from him. I think in this race, they're probably going to take back, make one run with a little more speed signed on, and if this comes apart a little bit, I think he's the one that you have to take a look at, and he's going to be a better price this day than he's been in some of his recent starts.
I don't disagree with that. I just overall still have some class questions with him, just following him through those allowance races and sort of needing some perfect trips or things in his favor. And certainly the pace, I agree, is going to be a lot more favorable to his running style. The other thing that is worth a mention in the Bold Venture is he was pretty reluctant to load that day, which is not something I've noted in the past. So maybe just something to kind of keep an eye on.
Right, let's move back to the 2-year-old action for the middle leg of this sequence, the Grade 1 Natalma. This is the one that's scheduled for the fillies, going a mile, same distance on the turf course, and this is a crazy race. I mean, we could spend an entire podcast on this race, honestly, talking about every horse, because there's just so much going on in here. We've already covered some of the horses that are cross-entered in the summer, but I think to discuss this race, we do have to kind of begin with the horse drawn on the inside, the Charlie Appleby Godolphin runner that's coming over, because these connections have had so much success, not just in North America, but particularly shipping to this weekend at Woodbine over the past few years. It seems like Godolphin has really targeted some of these races. They must like the course at Woodbine, sending a series of live runners over here. But it is worth noting, just in general, Godolphin and Charlie Appleby have not been quite as potent in 2023 as they have been in prior years. Maybe that's all going to change this weekend, because it seems like they're firing a couple of good shots at Woodbine, and the fact that jockey William Buick has come over for these two seems fairly meaningful. Dazzling Star, though, Emily, landing in a tougher spot than we sometimes see these races come up. I feel like typically you kind of want to default to a horse like this in a race like the Natalma, but this feels like an unusually strong field for this race.
Yeah, if what you had just said was on Twitter, I would just reply with like a this and like the pointing up like gif, because I totally agree with all of that. The trending has changed in 2023. This horse she could be very good. She's coming out of the Ascot Stakes, which she had a little bit of traffic. Seems like a keen type that wants to show more early speed, which is notable from the rail. And she's going to have to be much the best in this field. She's no gimme in here at what's going to be a short price, because everybody's going to talk about that, right? How good these connections have been over the years. But like we talked about earlier, these horses are individuals, and you have to assess them on individuals. And if you are playing those back trends, you could be stuck on the short end of the value stick, right? And I think she would be no surprise to win this race, but at a short price for how competitive and how good this field seems to be, I'm going to be looking outside of her.
Yeah, I mean, so her maiden victory too back at Newmarket was visually impressive, but just kind of reading some of the comments for there in time for, I mean, she wasn't beating much that day, and she faced a decent field last time, but like you said, she had a little bit of traffic in the middle portion of the race, but she had her chance and just didn't really finish off, and actually almost got caught for fourth at the end. She's by Blue Point, who was like a really good 5-furlong sprinter for these connections. And watching her run, I mean, she's got a lot of size to her for this point in the year, but she's sort of upright. She doesn't really stretch out in her stride. I mean, she's a powerful mover, but watching her, she doesn't really say to me that she's a horse that necessarily wants to go a mile, and it's a big stretch out from 6 to a mile for this horse. So I respect the connections, but she's not the kind of horse I'd want to take any kind of short price on. We've covered Erosa. We talked a little bit about Go With Gusto, who I think lands in a tougher spot here than she would if the connections decided to go in the summer instead. But we should mention a few other horses that are also coming out of the Catch a Glimpse or the Soaring Softly. What do you make of Erosa versus Ready to Jam, who is the Marcassi horse that was running after her at the end of the Catch a Glimpse last time? Because Feels like she's a horse that maybe got caught up in traffic a little bit and had to wait to make her run to catch a glimpse last time. Yet, by the same token, maybe that's the trip that you wanted to get in a race that featured such a fast pace.
I thought her trip was a little bit worse just because she was stuck behind horses just most of that race, had that trouble. Maybe we would have been best just if I didn't really think there was that much between them when it was all said and done. And so, Ready to Jam having more issues than Air Rosa. So I would prefer Ready to Jam, but this is a tougher spot, so much a tougher spot. Like if those two were running back, in a race at Woodbine on a regular weekend, I would take Ready to Jam over Air Rosa, just kind of a heads up. But in this race as a whole, I think both could be they're going to be tested in here. That's for sure.
100%, and there are a lot of ways to go, especially among some of the shippers from the U.S. I'll throw it to you. Where do you want to start? Because there are a lot of horses we could talk about. Who was really catching your eye at this race?
The horse that catches my eye in here is She Feels Pretty. I don't know if this is one that you landed on, but she didn't earn it. I think she's going to get overlooked in here for a couple reasons. The figure didn't come back that strong. The fact that the race is at Ellis Park. She has been off 2 months, though it is worth noting that she was entered the PG Johnson Stakes. That race taken off the turf back on August 30th, so that might have been some of the reason for the scratch. But also just kind of breaking those things apart as far as that speed figure. It was 5.5 furlong sprinting. I'll get into the trip. And back on July 16th at Ellis Park, that was like in the first part of the meet and when things had changed from Churchill. So if there was some intent maybe to run at Churchill and then they kind of had to shift things around a little bit, those are things you don't know, but at least considering given the timing. As far as She Feels Pretty, that race, just from a visual standpoint, she showed so much class. She broke a little bit slow, made a middle move mostly on her own. Once she was asked for run, she just responded extremely strong and was the only horse in that race that was making up ground. The winner, I shouldn't say the winner, not winner yet, but the second place finisher of that race did come back to win. The race has been productive as a whole, as far as horses running back, as far as horses improving their speed figures. So just from that visual standpoint, and then they're showing the works with her working up at Saratoga, watching her works. One of the things that just kind of caught my eye on that is she was working in company with a graded stakes horse called Gam's Mission. You could probably talk a little bit more since you follow that circuit up there, but she was holding her own with that one. And that's a graded stakes older mare. So that just showed me that they gave her a little bit of a class test. And I just think she's ready to run a big race in here, has a lot of ability, and probably one that gets overlooked.
Yeah, she's one that wasn't necessarily one of my keys in this race, but I agree with everything that you're saying. She's interesting in here. We'll be interested to see what kind of price she is. The 20-1 on the line seems extremely generous on a horse like her. But, I mean, she does have some hurdles to overcome with the big stretch out in distance. But I agree. That relentless rally in the maiden race really was eye-catching, so I think she's one that has some potential. A couple of interesting horses coming from Saratoga in this race. Brock Nardini had a really eye-catching maiden victory back in early August, though it did come against New York breds, and when you're watching that race, I think you want to not just take stock of her trip, but also take note of the fact that there were some horses that did have real trips in that race behind her, particularly a Christophe Clement horse that just got completely stymied in traffic that probably wasn't going to beat Brock Nardini, but would have had more of a say in the outcome than she ultimately did. That horse is actually, I think, running later today at Aqueduct, if you want to look at that trip. But Brock Nardini, she's a horse that has a big stride on her own. I know she kind of surprised the connections a little bit first time out, didn't take that much money, and they were sort of expecting her to need a race, but she just sort of won on raw talent alone. I don't think she beat much that day, and I mentioned the trip thing, but she's just a horse that is a little hard for me to gauge from a quality standpoint, because I like what I see from her physically. It just feels like this is such a big step up in class, and it makes me more interested in the number 12 Ozara of the horses coming from Saratoga maiden races, and Ozara is the one that I'm really intrigued by in this spot, because she didn't get a particularly fast speed figure, either looking at TimeformUS or buyers from us. But I just liked the race that she ran on debut. The runner-up in there, Weigh the Risks, is a horse that I know the connections, Chad Brown and Klarovich, they really liked, kind of talked about as maybe the best 2-year-old turf horse that Chad Brown has. And, she got held up a little bit, but basically had her chance in the stretch, and Ozara just held her off, and watching the stretch of that race was never letting that horse get by her. Weigh the Risks did come back to win a pretty salty maiden event after that, and Ozara, while she got a good trip on debut, I just liked the way that she handled herself within the race, because, she got over from the outside post, did save ground, but just did everything on her own, took every opportunity to advance into traffic, waited patiently, came through between horses like she had done it all before. Just seems like a horse that has a really good mind on her. And like we've already said, Christophe Clement has very good stats. He ships live horses up to Woodbine. So she's one that if she gets a little bit ignored just due to the low speed figure on debut, I think she's one that's pretty interesting in here.
I agree. I think she's one of the could be a contender in this race for sure for all of those reasons, and prefer her over Brock Nardini. Also, given the class test, was impressive. Another one that they had considered running in the PG Johnson Stakes, and just going back to that race and looking at kind of morning lines would have been 9-2. Well, you assigned the morning line. I don't know who I'm calling out here, but she would have been 9-2. Where She Feels Pretty was 6-1. Both those horses scratched. So just in terms of just one of the other things to mention, but I agree completely on Ozara.
Yeah, do want to mention just a few others before we move on from this race. The number 15, Rhapsody, who I guess if they all stay in, they'll run 15 at Woodbine. I didn't know they would do that, but there are no also eligibles in here, so I guess she's in the race. She is coming out of the Soaring Free against the males last time, and that was the race where Golden Canary just had everything her own way on the front end. Really a race where you wanted to be forward or saving ground, and Rhapsody was just kind of never in a great position that day. She was between and behind horses for a long way, and when she got out, the race has just gotten away from her by that point, and she finished up okay. Everybody sort of ran in place in the stretch, but she just feels like one that ran well on debut. The last race just kind of didn't work out for her from a flow standpoint, and looking at her and her pedigree, she's one that should be able to handle some added ground and could get somewhat overlooked among the Kevin Attard trainees that are entered in this race. So she's one that I do want to upgrade just based on what I think is going to be decent value.
I was a little bit, I'm taking the opposite approach on her. Just from a visual standpoint, I just don't think she's quite on this level. So I'm less interested in her, but she's definitely going to be a bigger price in here for sure.
And I should mention the number 13, Dea Matrona, who is the Chad Brown entrant in this race. It's kind of weird looking up Chad Brown's stats at Woodbine, because I was thinking back on it and I was trying to remember Chad Brown having success in this race, and I couldn't really come up with a horse. And, looking back in Formulator over the past 5 years, on the Woodbine turf, Chad Brown is just 4 for 34 with an 86-cent ROI. So he really, for some reason, just hasn't had much luck at Woodbine, or maybe just hasn't sent live horses up to Woodbine. So I think that's something to consider. I did watch her last race in France. It was visually impressive. I don't know what she beat. She could just take money based on the connections by default, and the fact that she's pegged 10-1 on the morning line. I think that enticing looking price might suck people into a horse that otherwise might not have taken that much money. So I kind of was on the fence about her.
I'm a little bit negative and kind of lukewarm the same way. I think she's going to be shorter than the morning line suggests, get a lot of attention for the connections. She was training for what is it? Is it Christopher Head overseas? Who I was like trying to just like research this horse to be like, what happened? Why did they get, the barn has been having a great year, having a lot of success. And they really didn't like talk much about this one. Like she was just kind of like under the radar, then like, oh yeah, she won a race, like, yay. And so I haven't been able to see her works. None of the works are posted up at Saratoga. I'm just inclined to watch a race, especially because I think she's going to be a short price in this really competitive race. Another one, if we're ready to kind of move on from her, that I do want to give a mention to is number 7, Simply in Front. She's a second-time starter. She finished second in her debut, a maiden special weight race here on August 18th. And coming out on the track, she just like visually was like, whoa, this horse looks incredible. And she broke slow. She made a move. That was a really strong effort from her. She's one that I just was like, put a mention, like follow this horse because she has ability. It's interesting that they show up here. I think she's a runner and she's going to give a good account of herself. She's going to have to be so incredible in order to win, just because some of the others that have the foundation under their belt. But keep an eye on her because she has some ability.
Yeah, that was a maiden race that came up surprisingly fast. I mean, the winner obviously had some prior stakes form running in a maiden race, but that horse even being the favorite, I mean, that just led home a field that got some pretty nice speed figures, and she ran fine on debut. I have no problem with that. Her potentially translating that form into improved effort here, and she is going to be a price in this race, just given connections and all that going on, so much else in this race. She's going to be somewhere in that 20-1 range, so definitely one that you can make a case for at a bigger price. As we move on to the 9th race, the feature on this card, the Grade 1 Woodbine Mile, the field gets much smaller, just 6 signed on here, and I think we're going to have a heavy favorite. And Emily, I'll just kind of state up front that this is a race that I struggled to find the clever angle, so I'm just going to hand it over to you and see if you've got something smart to say about this race, because I was struggling to come up with too much.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are going to kind of land on the same opinion, and so they're going to default to Master of Seas and or Cheryl Spite, and probably both, and just feel like it's going to be one of those two, and that'll be enough to move on. But as far as both these horses, Master of Seas, we talked about the Appleby attention, and that's going to carry in here. And he seems like he makes a little bit more sense. That was a good race last out at Ascot. Has some foundation under his belt, and I think they're looking for kind of a softer spot to get this horse a Grade 1 because he hasn't been as effective in Group 1 races overseas. So I think this is I'd probably prefer him of the two. And Cheryl Spite is going to get a lot of attention here for the connections. Won the Grade 1 Makers Mile. It was a really strong effort that day. Coming back this year, again, it kind of seems like this would be the horse, right? Second off the layoff. It's going to make that second start. This is going to be the time. This is the race they're pointing to. All those kind of narratives in here. But the race on August 19th, it didn't really excite me for it to be like, looking ahead, being like, okay, he's second off. He's going to improve off this race. I thought he was just kind of one pace in common. Wilson had been aboard in the past. Velasquez didn't take over today. Velasquez had been aboard in the past. It was going back to Gulfstream Park on the dirt, so tough to make much out of that. So I think there's some intent. But he's also running this race two other times. Two other times. One was as a 3-year-old, the first time in this race, and finished 7th. Wasn't really competitive that day. And then last year, I don't think the trip was as significant as some people were talking about. It was kind of one of those horses that, he would have won if, and I don't know. I don't really think so. Again, I could see it, but I'm less excited as a short price in the race. And if it isn't one of these two horses, I think that maybe you could find another one in here. Maybe Mark Casse thinks so. But yeah, what were your kind of thoughts on those two before we go on to some others?
Yeah, so I kind of went into this race thinking that I wanted to find a way to be against Master of the Seas to some degree, because he's going to be such a heavy lean in this sequence. But as I was kind of going through the form and trying to, upgrade Cheryl Spite a little bit, I watched their common race in the Dubai Turf, where obviously Master of the Seas was nowhere and Cheryl Spite was 4th, sort of a surprisingly good 4th against international competition over in Dubai. But gosh, I mean, my takeaway from that race was, boy, was Cheryl Spite lucky. I mean, he got such a good trip to finish 4th, saving all the ground and tipping out in the stretch, like the kind of trip that you want. And Master of the Seas, I mean, he had a no-chance trip in that race, was just wide with no cover every step of the way. And then I started to go back and watch some more of Master of the Seas races, and I mean, he should have won that Jebel Hatta back in early March when he was closing 3rd, losing by just a half leg. That was a race that was dominated on the front end. He was shuffled out of position in a roughly run race early on and had way too much ground to make up an upper stretch, but still almost got there. That race pointed him out as maybe a horse that was going to have a big season this year, and obviously needed some time off after that Dubai Turf. His last race at Ascot, obviously got a great setup. When you watch that race, It's actually a race that Classic Causeway was in, and there was another Godolphin horse in there, and Classic Causeway, or maybe the Godolphin horse, sort of served as a rabbit for the entire field as they kind of ran off, and it was just your typical pace collapse situation, and Master of the Seas definitely took advantage of that, but he also got himself running really early coming around the far turn and got into contention at the top of the stretch and looked for a second like he was just going to grind out a narrow victory, and then in the final furlong, he found another gear and just took off from that field and actually ran away from the other closers that were with the flow. So he was much the best that day, regardless of the fast pace, and just feels like a horse that has always had a lot of potential, and maybe the connections just finally have him going in the right direction. And unlike with the filly that they're bringing over for the Natalma, and that came up a super strong race, they've brought over a live horse, or it feels like a live horse, that is catching the kind of race that they were hoping to catch, because there's just not a whole lot in here. And going back and watching Cheryl Spite's other races, he is just a horse that gets really good trips. I mean, obviously, you mentioned the Woodbine Mile, and people made a lot of that, him not getting an ideal trip or having that minor trouble last year, but his Breeders' Cup Mile trip, where he was second, was absolutely perfect, saving all the ground. And I know that he had the excuse of coming off the layoff last time. I think Roger Atfield said that he had an issue with an illness prior to that, so maybe he wasn't fully cranked up, but I don't know. I have trouble seeing him beat Master of the Seas in the form that we saw him last time. So I was kind of I just kept finding myself going back to Master of the Seas as much as I wanted to be against him. To me, he just feels like a really legitimate favorite.
Yeah, I agree, and you're kind of selling me on a little bit more, and definitely I'm glad that you mentioned that trip last out, because I agree as well, and that course was also, it was one of those weird, like, good to soft rated races. And yeah, maybe Cheryl Spite needed the race last out, but how much more is he going to improve in 28 days, right? It's not like he's had, that much fitness from that race, and he's going to have to get back to be a sharp price. Mark Casse has the 3 horses that are on the outside, and I think in terms of class, they're probably a little bit below, especially of Master of the Seas. Is that type of overseas group horse. And of that group, I'm giving an edge to Ice Chocolat. In terms of trip and just in terms of placement, they've been running him in some pretty competitive races in terms of the races in New York, some grade 1 races, making a good close last out in a 4-star Dave. And I don't think he's going to be as kind of far back in this race, just given the class that he's coming out of those other races, this being one turn. He has some good one-turn form. He has form over this course in the past. And of that group, I think if he can get the right trip, just finds himself in the right place on the right day, he's one I'm definitely going to be using in here. Because for the reason that you mentioned, if you're trying to look outside Master of Seas, that's giving you some reservations, and we're both kind of negative on Cheryl Spite, maybe he's just the right horse in the right place and time.
Yeah, there are limited options outside of those horses.
Right.
I mean, I personally didn't want the horses out of the King Edward. I'm guessing they'll feel the same, just kind of skipping over those. And for me, I sort of have trouble taking Ice Chocolat in here because I really liked him last time in the 4-star Dave. I thought that was a great time to bet him because he was unexposed at that point as a turf router. I thought he had run deceptively well in the Kelso with a bit of a trip 2 back. And, it was like his performance in that 4-star Dave was like my entire Saratoga meet. I found a price that actually ran really well, and I just got to settle for second or third. It just wasn't quite good enough. And Mark Casse, he tried to do the same thing in that race where he entered a speed horse that didn't look competitive, My Sea Cottage, the same horse, and just tried to use that horse to basically create some pace and set it up for the race to fall apart a little bit and hope to get lucky with one of his other horses, Ice Chocolat, being the beneficiary. But it benefited Casa Creed and Annapolis as well, and they're just better horses than Ice Chocolat. And I feel like in this race, it's going to be the exact same thing where My Sea Cottage is going to go out to the front, set a legitimate pace, kind of be used as that rabbit, and then the race could come apart a little bit, but Master of the Seas has the same running style as Ice Chocolat, so he could be helped in the same way, and I just think he's a better horse. So I have trouble.
Let's say on that argument, like what if Annapolis or Casa Creed were in here?
I would probably prefer Casa Creed because I thought he just simply
Master of the Seas.
Well,
none of that group. Just like in this race, like both those horses, I think would by kind of default be kind of upgraded in here. Although Annapolis did run back at Kentucky Downs 3 years ago.
Well, I was kind of answering with regard to Ice Shock a lot. I mean, I just thought he didn't run as well as Casa Creed last time, basically, is what I'm trying to get at. And would I like Casa Creed in here versus Master of the Seas? You're putting me on the spot a little bit. I didn't think about that so much. I kind of have I feel like Master of the Seas has greater potential than those horses. If he takes his form from last time over here, he's the kind of horse that could be a Breeders' Cup Mile sort of horse. And I don't know if I really view Casa Creed as a Breeders' Cup Mile winner. I guess that's how I'd frame it.
That's fair. Yeah, absolutely. Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I thought the race was, I was less invested in the 4-star Dave, so I'm coming at it from a non-emotional standpoint. And I thought the race was fine, maybe a little bit further back. And this isn't a horse that I think is that kind of, well, I agree he needs some pace. I don't think he's necessarily, especially around 2 turns, going to be that like deep closing type that he was in that race. But yeah, it might just be as simple as Master of the Seas. We move on after it's all said and done.
Let's check out the final leg of this sequence, race 10, back to the Tapeta course. This is an optional claiming 32,000. Non-winners have won other than event, going the mile and an eighth distance around 2 turns. And another favorite that I think you sort of have to make some decisions about here, Emily, in the number 1, JP Hellish. And when I first went through this race, I was kind of, getting a little frustrated because I was like, this sequence is going to end with 2 short prices that look really strong. I kind of defaulted to Master of the Seas, and now I find myself having trouble making a case against this horse. But as I started to look a little deeper into this race, JP Hellish looks formidable at first glance, but you could start to poke some holes in him because, yes, he has this huge speed figure victory last time by 11 lengths, and if he repeats that race, he's going to win here. I think that's fairly obvious. But that came against a much weaker field, and it's not like he was that kind of horse before. He's been a little inconsistent at times, and maybe he's just a different horse in the Martin Drexler barn. That's certainly possible. He sends out a lot of live runners at Woodbine. I'm sure you can speak more to that than I can. I'm just looking at the stats. And once again, looking at the pace projection for this race, he seems like he's going to have things mostly his own way on the front end, but that doesn't mean that these horses necessarily have to run back to the same effort as last time when the field gets a little tougher.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at that race, it was much softer. There has been some horses that have run back from that race and have not been as successful and haven't been as successful against softer. One horse, the 4th place finisher, came back and finished 3rd for a $7,500 claiming race, so it was a wide trip, but still in terms of class, reliability, one of the horses that showed a little bit of speed, he faded. HC Holiday came up short at a similar level. HC Holiday finishing that distant second, came back with a 5th place finish at 2,500. So I don't fully trust him. Plus he was making that start off 99 days, so might have been fully cranked, had things his own way on the front end, got really brave. And I think the pace scenario is really interesting in here because when you do first look at it, it looks like JP Hellish is going to be lone speed, but going through kind of some of the horses in the past, looking back at past races, how they've run, the fact that this is 9 furlongs on the synthetic, some of the horses coming out of shorter races like U.S. Army Corps, the horse just to his outside, one that typically runs from off the pace. But if you look at his route races and you have to dig back, and they are limited samples and on the turf, he's a horse that's been forwardly placed. So that wouldn't surprise me if they show a lot more speed today, especially since they're kind of experimenting on some sneaky good efforts in those most recent starts. Some of the other horses in here, I mean, the 6 Cruden Bay has some natural speed that he's not going to be that far off. I thought there was one more in here that was going to be able to show a little bit more speed. But again, I don't think it's going to be as that like lone trip that it necessarily looks like, or at least a softer pace for him that could create a little bit of vulnerability just in terms of pace, in terms of class, and in terms of form to look outside of JP Hellish. So I would be willing to take him on in here, as he is going to be a short price.
Yeah, just in a general sense, I've watched a limited number of races at Woodbine this season. Do you feel like the Tapeta has been playing to speed at all? In TimeformUS, we have this algorithm that sort of codes certain days as being speed favoring or not, or favoring closers. And JP Hellish is coming out of a day, August 11th, where we have like a red color coding for the day, indicating that speed did well that day, or better than they were projected to do. Do you find that, or have there been any trends that you've noticed on the Tapeta this summer and into fall?
There have been, but I don't think it's as common. And again, it's just, kind of where that horse was on that particular day and that type of race shape. And also watching a lot of race at Woodbine, how the other riders in the race, in certain races that look like there should be lone speed, then all of a sudden there's 5 of them that are out there going to show speed on a particular day, and it changes everything. So I haven't seen it as extreme, but it wouldn't surprise me on that day of being one of the days where it was a little bit more prominent.
Yeah, and the thing we haven't really touched upon with JP Hellish that I think maybe the most important factor is that he's just a little cheap. I mean, he's a horse that for his entire career has just sort of been in for low claiming tags. I mean, 16,000, 20,000, 22,000, competing for the $25,000 tag last time. And sort of oddly, he's now still eligible for this N1X allowance condition. He's not in for the tag here. He's kind of running for his M1X for the first time ever, despite being an 8-time winner. And maybe it's a good sign that they're protecting him, where they could have run for the tag instead. But he's just a horse that hasn't always been up to the task of competing against competition when the waters get a little deeper. And you could just go back to Gulfstream 3-back when he was beaten by Super Cohiba, who's also in this race, and the pace worked against JP Hellish a little bit that day, and Super Cohiba got the trip. But I think it's just an example of, these horses don't always have to run back to their big effort. So I think you want to keep an open mind, trying to beat a horse that looks so obvious like JP Hellish. And I think you touched upon some of the good alternatives, Emily. Cruden Bay and Call Kurt, they're just classier horses that have competed at a higher level for most of their recent starts. And, Cruden Bay, he's a horse that you could probably label as a little bit of a hanger. He's got a tendency to finish second, and watching his last 2 races, he's gotten good trips and just hasn't been able to reel in some gate-to-wire winners. So, maybe that happens again with JP Hellish. But Call Kurt is a little interesting because he's gotten some wide trips, been in some pace situations that haven't really worked out for him recently. And putting the blinkers on, I agree with what you said, that he's a horse that there might be intention to have him a little more forwardly placed this time. The rider switch to Emma Jane Wilson. So I think he's the one that is the easiest to key in on, is maybe the horse to go after JP Hellish and potentially upset him.
Yeah, actually, I was talking about a different horse. I might have said his name by accident. I was talking about U.S. Army Corps as one that I thought would show a little bit more speed, but Cole Kurt is the horse that I landed on as well. Just in terms of class, he's been running at this level and running competitive races under similar distance. The June 18th race where he was covered up, he finished second in that race, but the winner had first run, and it was overall kind of the winning type race for the level. So that just shows me he can compete at this condition. He broke slow. He was wide, coming back 3 weeks later on July 9th. So I can give a little bit of an excuse for that race, and following a similar form cycle pattern coming back from that August 20th race, the second start of the form cycle. He was covered up and inside. The rider change, the blinkers, at least to me, that's showing intent, that they're saying this is a horse that he's been competitive at this level. What can we kind of slightly tweak in order to get him a little bit more competitive? And just another one that might catch the right field. Since I was touching on U.S. Army Corps, if I kind of spoke on that horse, is one that I think is going to show speed because he's stretching out and he has some limited route races on the turf where in the past he was forwardly placed, and he was forwardly placed on some fast paces. But his other races at this level, he was competitive as well. It was better than Luke Race in that 5th place finish 2 back on August 13th. So I think he's going to at least be in here to mix things up and make things a little bit tougher on JP Hellish than it might look on paper.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I actually wanted to mention U.S. Army Corps a little more, and sorry for mixing up those two about the pace, but I agree with what you just clarified there. As for U.S. Army Corps, there's a case to be made for this horse, and you were starting to mention his prior route races, and I agree with that. I mean, he's gone longer, mostly on the turf as opposed to the synthetic, but I mean, he's handled route distances in the past, and they've sort of pigeonholed him as a sprinter recently, and he's sort of gotten a little outrun in some of those races, but he's not one of these horses that lacks early speed. If you watch that race on July 16th, he actually broke on top and had the lead for a little while before they just weren't that aggressive with him and settled a little further back, and then he got sort of sawed off between horses at the top of the stretch and gave up after that. But like you said, 2 back that race at Woodbine on August 13th, he was towards the back the entire way, and it just looked like they didn't... let's say Daisuke Fukumoto underestimated how much horse that he had underneath him, because this horse was really running through the wire and was never really asked for anything at any point in that race, just kind of doing it all under his own power. He seems like a better synth horse than he is a turf horse, and I just think his recent form is better than it looks, and he's going to get ignored here because he's going out for a barn that hasn't sent out a winner yet this year, but a barn that, if you look back over the past 2 or 3 years, has sent out some prices, including when this horse was a price to win at Woodbine. So capable connections, and I just think this horse is a little bit interesting and is not going to be on most people's radar.
Yeah, and even if you want to key off that race a little bit more, when he upset at a price back last October 16th, it was a similar move. It was a turf to synthetic move, and was a turf to synthetic move coming back this year in that July 16th race as well, where he put in that good race with that subtle trip. So yeah, he's sneaky in here for sure.
I think that rounds out the handicapping of the sequence, unless there was anybody else you wanted to mention in this race. I think we covered some of the main contenders. But Emily, if we're going to look at a Pick-5 sequence like this, I think we do have to mention that there is that lower minimum. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think there's the 20-cent minimum at Pick-5 at Woodbine, and I think it changes the way that a lot of people want to attack these wagers, because the first inclination when you're looking at a sequence like this is, oh, low minimum, I can spread as much as I want. I think that's sometimes a mistake, and you can fall into a trap doing that. You could still play this sequence multiple times if you have strong opinions, or you could still even play it for a lower amount to win more. You don't necessarily have to just increase the size of your wager by throwing in more horses that you don't necessarily love. I mean, there are some races where maybe you're just desiring to catch a price, but you can also key in on some of those prices and not make your ticket too bloated just because the minimum is lower.
I agree with you. I think that overspreading just, kind of waters down your opinion and waters down your payout in general. And we are going to talk about just kind of putting together the Pick-5. But, keep in mind, like, the doubles are an alternative. And if you have some good opinions, watching those pools, because it is a lower takeout. And part of the reason that at Hawthorne we lowered the win play show was part of the reason because people play the Pick-5. They're live in the first leg and then they kind of stop playing, right? And then it's like, then you realize you're like, oh, I loved a 10-1, and I, just because I had in my Pick-5, I didn't play it, and so play, if you're going to play the Pick-5 just in general, keep in mind that there are other ways to play as well. And if you have good opinions, make sure that that good opinion is covered in as many ways possible for when you hit. But yeah, cycling back in terms of the Pick-5, do you want to start with the 6th or start with the 10th and go backwards?
Yeah, no, let's go back through. You can start with the 6th and just kind of, we don't have to touch on every horse. We handled the handicapping already, but just mention some horses that you want to key on in this sequence and maybe touch upon how you might structure it in a general sense.
Yeah, and the 6th was just summer. I think I would be a little bit more skinny again. You'll have to just, pay attention to those scratches in here. But I think we kind of keyed on the 2 horses that look to stand out: Carson's Run, My Boy Prince, with some of those others in here. In terms of race 7, that was a race where a little bit softer on Patches O'Houlihan, one that maybe this is the time, but he's going to be certainly overplayed in the Pick-5. So if you're trying to kind of look for some separation, this is one of the spots in here to do so. Natalma is just, it's loaded with talent. I think both you and I have some opinions in here. It's some horses that are prices that if you're playing the Pick-5, maybe play a couple tickets. And if you have an opinion in here, use that one pretty heavy. As far as race 9, kind of the same thing. It's a more compact field in terms of having those opinions. And then closing out, if you are trying to beat JP Hellish, at least you'll have some price payouts in that pay leg.
Yeah, I think we're similar with structure in this sequence. Beginning it off, I would lean a little bit on Carson's Run. I'd want most of my play to go through him. I'd use My Boy Prince.
Oh, go with Gusto for sure. Sorry, forgot that one. Yeah.
Yes, and yeah, I was just about to say I would upgrade Go with Gusto if she stays in this race. Just note she's not a horse I included in my picks when I did picks for my video, but it's sort of a horse that I've circled back to. So I'm upgrading her a little bit as I've reassessed this race. So if she goes in here, she's one that I'd want to include somewhere, not as my main horse, but just as a backup. In the Vigil, I kind of want to go 3 deep, and I'll have to decide how to structure them. But those 3 are Patrick O'Houlihan, who I'm looking to beat a little bit, but a horse that I think is dangerous in here and legitimate. But the two prices are Super Watson and probably even more so My Buddy B, who I just think is an interesting new face in this group. In the Natalma, I was kind of most interested in Ozara, and then behind that one, it's tough to separate these horses. I think Ready to Jam is interesting. Rhapsody's interesting. The horse that Emily mentioned, She Feels Pretty, is interesting. So I'd use all of those and maybe even look to go deeper if I'm writing some other legs on some backup tickets with my strong opinions in the surrounding races. I could use horses like Simply in Front or a horse like Go With Gusto in this race, which I think is a little tougher. I'd probably leave out Dazzling Star for Appleby. I just don't really love this spot for her. In the Woodbine Mile, I don't want to overcomplicate it when my opinion is just that Master of the Seas is better than these horses. So as much as I don't want to go with the flow, I'm going against the flow enough in other races that I feel like I just kind of have to key on the opinion that I have in here, which is that Master of the Seas is likely to win. And then closing it out in the 10th, I've been looking to take some shots against JP Hellish, particularly with U.S. Army Corps, as well as the number 8 Call Kurt, who I think Emily and I agreed was the main danger. Well, Emily, fun sequence to handicap, and just to circle back, I echo everything that you said about the ways to play sequences like this, or just days like this in which pools to get involved in. You don't want to have a strong opinion and then not play it the right way and not get paid. The win bet at the end of the day can be your friend, or even doubles or pick threes, that sort of thing. You don't have to get involved in a pick 5 just to always be swinging for the biggest score. Sometimes the pick 5 is the right sequence to play because it's the best opportunity, but you also want to cover your bases and make sure that if you're right in the spots that you really care about, that you're coming out ahead.
Absolutely. And I love touching on like the handicapping side as well as the gambling side, because oftentimes that gambling side can get totally lost in the handicapping discussions.
100%. And it's easy to get caught up in the minutia of ticket structure, or am I playing in the right pool or takeout, or am I a good handicapper, or am I a good bettor? And there are so many factors to consider. And, that's what I like. I like having these discussions. I think there is a lot of good podcasts out there. There's been great content created over the past year. I love some of the conversations that you did at the NHC this year about stuff like this. I mean, you focused on contest play, but also just general wagering strategy. And I think the more discussions that people like us have about this, the more beneficial it is for the listeners.
Absolutely. And again, I know you and I talk all the time. We talk we had a really good conversation about harness that probably would be good content for somebody to discuss. So I appreciate you having me on. I hope, everything's going well with Craig. Totally thinking of him. But I really appreciate you bringing me back on and getting me the opportunity and the platform to talk to our horse player audience.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time, and I always enjoy handicapping with you. Everybody, thanks for listening this week to our analysis of this Woodbine Saturday Pick 5. But you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Crossing my fingers, I'm hoping that Craig's able to rejoin me on Tuesday for the Pacecast, but I'll put something out on Twitter with our plans for that when I learn a little more. But we'll definitely be back with some podcasts for next week, so make sure to tune in then. Thanks for listening, everybody.